The first of the houses set ablaze and destroyed in the reprisals of September 1920 in the wake of the Renine ambush. This is Patrick Hugh O'Neill's house. He was father of Ignatius and Lexi, who were both, well, Ignatius was the leader really of the IRA locally, and so presumably they were marked men. And the house here, it's just bordering Hills Lane there. So, yeah, so then in March, 31st of March 1921, on foot of a broader instruction, national instruction from the IRA, that actions should be taken to mark the Easter Rising. And on foot of that, the local groups of local volunteers decided to launch an attack here in Miltown. And they came down from the Blard Road, down Hills Lane, and hid in the ruins, what was then the ruins of O'Neill's building, which had been, as we said, destroyed the previous September. And they waited for RIC members to emerge, that being the payday, and the expectation being there'd be a good number of them out around town. But in the event, only 2 of them appeared, and they emerged from the pub here beside us and were then shot from the ruins there. And one of the constables, Constable Stanley Moore, was killed. The other man who lay underneath him wasn't. And that, on foot of that, there were no immediate reprisals for that, but on the 6th of April 1921, the British military and RSE exacted vengeance in the form of reprisals, where the premises just down the street here, John Sullivan's, which is now the Bridal Emporium there, and Michael Hayes's premises in the Ennis Road. Michael was a cooper, and those premises were blown up by explosives, and the local people were rounded up and forced to watch this, and those 2 were destroyed. So those were the last 2 reprisals on the 6th of April 1921.
This is around the area where the 2 constables were.
Yeah. They were after coming out of Wilson's, I think. Yeah. So it would be out of Hawks.
Yeah.
The front.
Hawks was burnt down, so
was burnt. Yeah.
The ruins at that
yeah.
stage,
Well, that was Ignatius's at the time, like so.
And Lexi too was brother.
Lexi was, and there was 2 others as well.
Was there?
I think there was 4.
No, but of the O'Neill family.
Yeah, I think there was 4 boys in it, as far as I know.
Lexi
and Ignatius would be the more, but I think, I don't know, was there a John? And
they were hidden. They were actually hidden, according to your research there, Seamus. They were actually hidden in the remains of the building, and they waited patiently to see who was going to come out. Yeah. And the 2 constables came out.
Yeah, they came down Hills Lane kind of.
And waited there. They waited for a while there. And apparently, according to that research again, it took a little while before they left the door. They were talking to Mr. Wilson, whoever was there at the time.
That'd be his grandfather.
Probably, yeah. And then they walked away from it, and the shooting started.
They expected the whole entire crowd to be there that night.
Yeah, on the tear, yeah.
Yeah.
It was pay night, according to what we read. Yeah.
Sorry, it was pay night. Oh yeah, so they expected them to be all that winter, yeah.
Well, this was a general instruction from the Mid-Clare Brigade that it was to happen in a few places on the basis of pay night.
Yeah, pay night. As a commemoration of the Easter Rising. Yeah. That was it. Yeah. I think it was more general than the Mid-Clare Brigade.
Was it? Okay. And you know what was remarkable about that research that I thought when I was reading it? That when the IRA men who had carried out the assassination or the shooting came over and began to take the ammunition and the identification and things like that off the bodies, that they didn't notice that one of them was still alive.
He was lying under the other.
And of course that immediately beggars the question. He did a good job because
he probably was.
It was the wisest course of action.
It was, because he could well have been executed on the spot then.
Yeah. I'd say no doubt he would have been executed on the spot. Okay.
Like that was the way up to the Clonbunny races and the other races that were there. It was up that way that the people entered, but that's outside of what you're doing now. Like, but there was a big race, well, at least a mock-up race course there in the place where the Super Value is at the moment, in that place, that field there.
Yeah, one of the developments that happened after that event that Seamus here described was that as compensation for what happened to the local people, it was then allowed that because it was a reprisal to an event that happened, because of that, the owners of the premises had the choice to force, or at least get the British government to rebuild the premises, or they could rebuild themselves on the basis of the compensation they received. And I think most of the people did the rebuilding themselves and organised local builders to do that, I suppose.
The owners, they went for the red brick. I suppose that was a kind of a modern trend, I suppose, at the time, to be completely alien to West Clare. So I don't know exactly where the red brick came from, but that was their choice.
There could be a connection there with one of the builders who was they were a Limerick firm, the O'Sullivans, and one of the most dominant buildings going into Limerick once upon a time was Clune's factory, which was completely, the facade was completely covered with red brick, which apparently was imported from Italy. So possibly there was a connection there as well, because the builders that did some of the work here in Miltown were also from actually Limerick themselves, the O'Sullivan family, who still have connections with us. So that's a possible explanation.
Yeah, but even the laneway was a hive of industry one time too. You had cobblers and coopers and different occupations up there as well. Like, so.
Across from us here now is John Sullivan's Drapery, which was one of the two premises blown up by explosives by the Crown forces on the 6th of April 1921 as a reprisal for the killing of Constable Moore on the 31st of March. This premises was a drapery, sometimes called a warehouse in the census forms. And John, obviously these two families would have been very sympathetic to the independence movement. Interestingly, one of the daughters of John Sullivan, she was here on the night of the census, is Máire Ní Shúilleabháin, who was the first female organiser for the National Education Board, the first female Irish language organiser going around the country, the Timera as they were called, who were organising the promotion of Irish locally. And she spent 4 years with them, and then her health failed and she went to Australia and unfortunately continued her work there with the children in the schools, with the children of Irish immigrants to Brisbane, and she died in Brisbane aged 30.
The secretary of the shop, or the teller, she was up on a raised platform, and you paid there, and she had one of these and you pulled the, sure it only had to cross it, you know.
And it swung across the
That's right, it came over the premises.
Yeah, but they had a lovely...
And I wonder were they confined to drapery, because I remember two of those in my youth in Ballina, County Meow, and there were two drapery shops. And they were the only ones I ever saw those pulleys squirting back. So I just wondered, like, was it a feature of big drapery shops more than it?
Well, where I would have seen it first ever was in Limerick, in one of the big stores in Limerick.
Cash company in Ennis, yeah.
But imagine having it in a store here in Miltown. Well, it seems that on the night of the reprisals, the local people, as many adults as they possibly could round up, were rounded up and brought to witness what was about to happen, I suppose as a threatener or a frightener or whatever, and they were made to stand at what appeared to be a safe distance, but again, it's hard to know because the destruction was brought about by bombing, whatever kind of bombs they had at the time, and also by the use of petrol to ensure, I suppose, that the destruction of the place was complete. So that was carried out, and as I said, the adult population in the main were made stand by and watch this act. And again, similarly to the other situation with O'Neill's house, because this was a reprisal, again, at a later stage, it was on the British government to either rebuild the premises or on the owners of the premises themselves to do the reconstruction of it. But it sounds like a fairly brutal demonstration of their fast losing power of control, that they would bring out local innocent people and force them to witness such a destructive act, and also to have them so close to what happened with the use of a bomb and petrol, because it could have been much more tragic than that. But anyway, that's what happened.
So just across the road here from is Marnan's, Malachy Marnan's, which again is distinguished by being restored with the red brick front, as I think 4 or 5 of those premises were. As we were mentioning, people had the choice of rebuilding themselves or whatever. And this is a fine building, as you can see. Malachy Marnan's, whose niece later, Kitty, married Jimmy Ward, the famous banjo player and member of the Kilfenora Ceilidh band. So this was destroyed in the reprisals after the Runeen ambush on 22nd, and the night of the 22nd and into the 23rd of September 1920. Would you have anything to say about, we've just covered both of those places, yes. Marnan's now, do you have anything?
Like, I can remember that, I remember of Malachy himself anyway. He was a tallish, but I think he was a fairly good poet. I think he was spontaneous, he could come up with a verse like.
Kitty ran that shop there for years. I remember.
She did,
She was there for a period.
Was it?
Really? Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
From Jimmy Ward.
Was it? Yeah. Oh, well, that was like.
I got a right immersion in Clare traditional music.
Oh, yeah.
From a Kilfenora angle.
Yeah.
The Lockney Nathan, those didn't sort of materialise that.
They didn't rate.
A lot of the players that came to do.
I was just wondering, maybe we might just take a shot of where the RIC barracks would have been and the courthouse. So we can just move down here to the Malbay. We said anything already? Yeah. Just in front of us here was, I suppose, the nerve centre really of the British power in the town, in the sense that in front of us, where Sean Burke's carriage is now, it was the courthouse, which, as the independence struggle went on, was largely disregarded in favour of the Sinn Féin courts under hidden conditions. But here on the right then, and on the Flag Road side, was the barracks, the RIC barracks, which at that time in the 1920-21 period also housed black and tan. So there were, we're told there were between 30 and 35 RIC and tans located there. On the other side is the post office, then later became Maguire's Hotel, and occupied by the British forces then up to 1922, subsequently, just before evacuation. And from this premises, the RIC would have gone up the town towards the Canada Cross when the shootings took place earlier. That was in April, 14th of April 1920, and where 3 men were shot in cold blood: Patrick Hennessy, Thomas O'Leary and John O'Loughlin.
Yeah, a connection, I suppose,
His Uncle Joe Hennessy.
going back to my Uncle Joe Hennessy, who was a local shoemaker and shoe shop in town, married a local lady, Kitty Flynn that was, and they spent the first years of their married life in the apartment that had been converted by the Hillarys upstairs here in the corner. That was above the courthouse, was it? Yeah. So just a connection, that's all. Yeah, okay, we're standing in front of what used to be Roach's premises now. And Sarah, what kind of premise, what business did they do? Ned Roach's, yeah. The main thing I remember about the name Roach is that Ned Roach, who conducted his business here, was actually a member of the 1917 Clare football team, senior, the only senior football team to reach an All-Ireland final. And he was one of the Miltown members of that team. And they were beaten by Wexford in that final. So that's what I remember about him. I remember very little about the premises other than the fact that it was owned by the Guy Lynch, as he was known to us. So you might fill in something there, sir.
Well, in the guy's time, it was a mostly public house, but probably before that it might have been a small grocer and a public house as well.
And it was one of the premises burned in retaliation to for the Renine ambushes. So any idea what was Mr. Roach considered to be a sympathiser or active or anything like that we know of?
Well, I suppose the fact that he was involved in the football and Clare and Miltown, I suppose that was enough. He was
to be suspect, yeah.
So just across from us here now, the premises owned by Casey's on this side, Michael Casey at the time, and at the far side, Collins's. And those were also destroyed in the reprisals after the Renine ambush.
All right.
Yeah, Collins is now Michael Lads. Yeah. And
Michael Lads,
you know, it's very hard when I looked at your write-ups again to even imagine why Collins's was burned, because I only remember Jim's father and mother as being absolutely quiet, easy-going people.
They were very relaxed.
Very, very, very peaceful people, and yet there you are. And Casey's.
Their father again, I suppose.
It was their father, yes. Oh yeah, it was there at the time.
Hawl an seo uainean is tá an teach ina rugog Tomás Ó Hé in 1866. Níor chaise ach néam léana an seo, mar bhog an clán sios go dtí bór na hinse nuair a tógeog an teach nua an sean in 1865.
Well, it is just at the moment the occupier of the Frozen Spoon is a nephew of the chap that was involved in the Renine ambush at the time. Grandnephew.
The current leasee of the Frozen Spoon, who set up the business as a very successful coffee shop, is Joe Beakey. And Joe's from Corofin, and he's graduated to that Renine ambush. One of the gentlemen in the front left of the photo is actually Joe's uncle. So there is a strong connection.
Joe's granduncle, is it?
No, his uncle in the photo, but it was his granduncle who was actually took part in the actual ambush. But Joe, as I said, is from Corofin. He now lives in Gart himself, but he runs this successful coffee shop here. So there you go. We're standing now outside the market house, as it's known as, which is where it seems that the troop or battalion, whatever they were called, of RIC and Scottish regular soldiers were mustered and under the orders of Sergeant Hampson to break up the celebration that was actually coming to an end over at Canada Cross. And sadly, as a result of confusion or lies or some stories, the troops here opened fire towards the crowd. And there are many different stories as to how the incident happened, but one that I heard early on was that my grandfather and Cyril's father were coming back up the town to warn the people at the Canada Cross that there was danger coming, that the troops under Sergeant Hampson were coming to break up the assembly. And the story I heard originally was that as they were running across the far side of the street, the soldiers here fired at them, and my grandfather was hit. And as a result of that, he ended up dying in what was Honan's house at the time. He was tended to by Dr. Paddy Hillary's father, before he passed out. Now there are other discoveries have been made to do with Hampson's activity in it, and one of them being that two of the three men who died were shot at close range by pistol fire. So these are all the stories that we heard. But it seems too that despite the so-called terms of engagement which were required at the time, that the whole thing was in chaos. And from evidence, it seems that some of the RIC soldiers, or whatever they were called at the time, were young and inexperienced, and that their efforts to obey the commands to fire at the crowd were so haphazard that the actual regular soldiers stood up from the squad and stood back against the wall here to avoid, they say, being shot themselves. So that's how disorganized and whatever. So there are many different stories, but two historians, Padraig O'Rourke and the local man, Dr. Tracy, have unearthed a lot of different evidence as to how the incident happened. And that story perhaps is for another day, Seamus, maybe.
The other two men?
The other two men that died, yes, the other two men that died in that were John O'Loughlin, who was a young man aged around, I think it was 28, from the Ennistimon Road. And 2 years previously, his brother had died fighting in the First World War for the British Army. And he was shot just at the right-hand side of the Canada Cross. And the other man that died was Thomas O'Leary. Thomas O'Leary had been a member of the British Army and had been part of one of the, I suppose, one of the well-known landings, the landings in Suvla Bay, and he survived that and came back home to Miltown to be to rear his family of 10 children. And it's an absolute ultimate irony that he was shot here on the orders of, on the disarray or the orders of a drunken British sergeant. And he died just over at Canada Cross underneath the sign that tells us that it is Canada Cross, father of 10, as I said. So they were the three men, including my grandfather, who died there. My grandfather was 29, and I had two sons at the time, and my own father was yet to be born. He came a few months later. So as well as the three men that died and are remembered in Ballard, also 11 other people were injured in the shooting. So all that came out in an inquest at a later stage.
I suppose what we're looking at the moment is the rebuilt premises Jones's, which was burned the night of the Renine ambush as a reprisal. People said at that time that was two one-storey buildings, the dwelling house and the shop and the bar. So when the compensation came years later, they only got enough to build a roof height, so they finished themselves. So I don't know, is that enough?
Was it always a two-storey high building before that, sir?
No, it wasn't. It was just one story.
Oh, so, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So the picture is fairly clear. Then
some people said it was an attached roof that was in it. Whether that's true or whether it was thatched or slated, we don't know. But,
and so the process of rebuilding had started long before, as you said, the compensation was awarded, wasn't it?
Well, I presume it was. Like, I think the stones came from Rockmount, which was just over there by the church. It was near enough. Other people in town, when the compensation came, they got the red brick and I suppose more modern houses built. But, we were satisfied with this.
Was the shop and pub always on that side?
The dwelling house was at this side, and the shop and the pub was at that side there then as well, on the right-hand side. There was two separate entrances. The hall door at the moment was down where the shop door is at the moment, and then the shop door itself was roughly in the middle of where the big window is now.
And again, it was in the style of a lot of them. The grocery was to the front.
Well, it was, and the bar to the back then. And,
with a lovely high counter.
That's right.
I remember. And I actually remember the bacon slicer in particular Was it a big red
It was big.
device that was terribly impressive looking and rotated by hand?
That's right, yeah. It was
You were renowned for the quality of your bacon.
It was Berkel. Well, as a matter of fact, when my father started on the main street, a 3-story house, he started importing bacon from Canada. Now, the brand name of the bacon was Tango. So
It's a catchy name.
it was. So that house is still referred to as the Tango.
Oh, is it?
It
Okay.
is, it is,
The 3-story.
So
but,
your mum and Catherine lives it.
yeah, but it seems to have been very popular bacon because he made a name for it, and then I suppose he moved up here with my grandfather, and he continued on here then in the business, two of them there together.
And have you any information as to what they actually did to the occupants of the house, or who was here at the time of the actual burning?
No, I think word got out that they were coming to town, and I think most of the people went up behind the houses. I know a lot of them to Johnny Curtin's field as we knew it. A lot of them spent the night there under the hedges. Some of them that had relations out the countryside, they went to them. You know, there was in-laws and ones like that, but most of them stood out because when the crew moved down the town to do more damage, some of the neighbours got in our back door and they retrieved the sitting room table. That's what we were looking at a while ago, the leaf of the thing gives the bullet hole.
And did it start here with your house, sir?
No, I think O'Neill's Ignatius was the first. And
as it would be, I suppose, with his
yeah,
prominence.
they worked their way up, but before they fired in the windows here before they came in, and then they did a bit of looting, and then they broke in the door and the windows with the rifle butts, and that was the place. With petrol, they seem to have no limit to the amount of petrol and other incendiary liquids they had that night. So they took what they wanted before they set it on fire.
And while you say they were doused, the premises were doused with petrol, the people carrying out the atrocities were doused with booze.
Oh, they were.
That they had stolen from the various premises. Because funnily enough, there's an interesting reflection there in the information you produced, Seamus, of a local man laying his hands on one of the carbines, one of the small, sharp rifles that were used.
Michael McMahon from Clonbunny.
Michael McMahon from Clonbunny, who was here.
Oh, yes,
and that
I
was
know
in the early hours of the morning, I gather, that this tan, well drunk, according to the story there, according to the reflections of the person involved, that he actually threatened to shoot Michael McMahon.
Yes.
And Michael McMahon had a box of some items from the store that he had retrieved and saved, and that he threw them in the direction of the tan, and it was enough to frighten the life out of the man.
The man got scared and ran.
Who took off, and it seems then that Michael discovered the carbine neatly parked against the wall and took it as a souvenir. So, but I mean, the truth of that is just that all these atrocities were fueled by absolute drunkenness from liquor and whatever else was stolen from
and totally out of control.
And totally out of control. No rule of law, nothing.
Well, another story about the premises here is Joe Halloran that lived 3 doors down from our place. He'd have been young at the time. They were tailors. But up at school one day the children started talking about the atrocities in town, and one of them suggested that would it be worth going through the rubble above in Jones's, would we find the till? So they came there systematically for a few days after the burning and went through all the rubble, and somebody saw something shiny in a hole. So they excavated, and he thought he had a sixpence, but what came up was a whole conglomeration of coins, pennies and tuppences, sixpences, shillings, all fused together.
Oh.
So they couldn't separate any of the...
It's had a real kill if they're separate.
Yeah, I've just sent to be a lovely souvenir to have now.
Yeah, it would.
But again, a proof of the intensity of
Of
the
the
damage that was
intensity of
done,
the heat,
that
like.
fuel kinds together like that.
Yes. River that causes all the floods just coming out, J.J. O'Brien's or James Gate, and goes down along, and it finally ends up in Clonbunny. But at the far side of that, you have Clonbunny. Now,
that river, yeah.
yes, and if you had 3 legs, you could have a leg in Clonbunny, a leg in Legar North, and a leg in Breaffa. That's just in the middle of the road.
It starts here in the middle of the road.
That's right.
So we call it the meeting of the legs, as
Yes.
opposed to the wall.
So the river comes down there under the house, under James's yard. And under
That's
the
right,
street.
and straight down.
And out and you can see it up here.
And it floods all the back of those houses, Harry, yeah.
Yeah.
And the other thing, Seamus, by the way, Sarah mentioned earlier on, Catherine Heaney, or you mentioned her,
That's right.
a descendant of one of the brave blacksmiths.
right.
She lived
That's
just
right,
there.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
In front of us here is the house of Michael Hayes, which was the second house destroyed as a reprisal on the 6th of April 1921 in the wake of the killing of Constable Stanley Moore. The house itself was blown up by explosives in front of the people. It was later rebuilt in 1926, and there is, it's a very interesting house inside in that it has a fireplace with the names of all the nationalist heroes of the late 19th century, Alan Larkin and O'Brien, Charles Stewart Parnell, John Dillon, and all these still engraved on it, and the mantle of the fireplace still shows the effects of the first attack. It was exceptional in that it was attacked twice. It was first of all half burned, as it says, in the wake of the Renine ambush, as part of the Renine ambush reprisals. But the second time then it was really destroyed utterly. And there is a plaque in front of it. This was the house in which Tomás O'Hay, the famous poet, dramatist, very versatile major cultural figure at the turn of the 20th century, who taught most of his life in Dublin and who wrote many dramas, wrote songs such as Farewell to Miltown Malbay and Going to the Fair, My Name is Nora Daly, that one. And he moved here. The house itself was built in 1875, according to the inscription inside. But the plaque outside was erected, and in commemoration of it. Agus is as gaeilge tá sé mar seo. D'éirí sé as a luithreach ríist. Dhéanna black and tans lagó an tig seo fes a trí né néidir fithe treis léacháin rinín. The place go gé mar gníomh scanara agus díaltais sé néidir fes a hen agus Micheál O'Hay dahóg néidir fes a sé. So in translation, it arose from its ashes again. The black and tans half burned this house on the 23/9/1920 after the Renine ambush. It was blown up as an act of terror and revenge on the
6/9/1921.
Micheál O'Hay rebuilt it in 1926, and also on it is hard to distinguish, but the coat of arms of the Hayes clan. I suppose the census of 1911 says that Michael, age 42, who was a master cooper, and Catherine, his wife, she was 31, and his mother, Mary, 79, they had no children. And the premises was described as a shop. So,
well, there's been a reason for him being here as well, because all Byrne's front there was the butter market.
Oh, okay.
That's where all the local butter was brought in to be processed and barrelled. And the fact that he was a cooper, he was living near the premises as well. So I suppose there was some logic. I think that's where all the butter was taken from and more or less got ready for export. And I think a lot of it went out to the butter market in Cork.
And that butter, sir, was that contributed by local?
It would be all, you had 2 pounds maybe, and somebody else had 5 pounds, and another body had a stone, like, so it all added up, like, at the end of the day. And I suppose that it was the woman's money, you know, the same as the eggs, when she brought the eggs into the market or to the shops. That money was used to buy groceries and tea and sugar, and they were the popular items of the time. Like, they had nearly everything else themselves. They were self-sufficient in vegetables and meat and potatoes and things like that. So.